Okay, so there's an Odyssey adaptation in production right now, and I've been watching the discourse around it, and honestly, it's doing something to my brain. Not because people are upset about the changes. Changes are fine. Adaptations have always changed things. That's not the problem. The problem is the kind of changes being discussed. The kind of changes that keep coming up in every single conversation around every single myth based project lately. And the more I think about it, the more I realize this keeps happening for the same reason every single time. And nobody talks about this. Not really. I mean, people talk around it. They talk about representation, about accessibility, about updating stories for modern audiences, but they don't talk about the actual thing that's going wrong. So let me explain. So the Odyssey is not about a story, is not a story about a character we're supposed to relate to. I don't mean that in a dismissive way. I mean it literally. The Odyssey was not designed around the idea that you should understand Odysseus the way you would understand a coworker or a best friend. Odysseus isn't supposed to feel like a guy going through something. He's supposed to feel like a force, like cunning itself wearing human skin. Apologies for that, guys. Where were we? Oh, yes. Like the part of the human experience that is not comfortable, not trustworthy, not morally clean, and somehow that is fascinating and true and deeply unsettling at the same time. That's the thing. The strangeness is the point. And this is what annoys me. Because so many modern adaptations seem to walk up to that strangeness and go, yeah, we're gonna fix that. We're gonna soften the edges. We're gonna give him a redemption arc. We're gonna make him someone the audience can root for in a clean, emotional way, instead of someone they have to sit with uncomfortably. And you end up with a guy. Just a very tired guy who wants to go home. Which is wild because they started with one of the most myth-rich characters ever written, and they land on tired guy wanting to go home. Because, hold on, so I want to say this as precisely as possible. I'm not saying that myths should be untouchable. I'm not saying adaptations should be museum exhibits. I'm not saying, by a long shot, that audiences want everything to be exactly like the source material, because they don't. Nobody's asking for a 4-hour Homer recitation in ancient Greek. That's not what we're talking about. What I'm saying is there's a specific instinct that keeps showing up. This instinct that takes the stronger parts of myth stories and sands them down, smooths them out, and makes them make sense in a modern framework. And every time that instinct wins, the adaptation gets smaller. Not worse in every way, necessarily, but smaller, less strange, less looming. And this is where it starts to get stupid. A myth that isn't large anymore isn't really doing what myths do. So what do myths do exactly? Well, this is where I think people get lost, because there's this assumption that myths are just old stories, like proto-screenplays, rough drafts of human storytelling that we've now evolved past. And that is such a backwards way to think about it. Myths aren't primitive storytelling. They're just a different kind of storytelling. They're not trying to do the same thing as novels and films and TV are doing. they're doing something entirely different. Something that requires the characters to be larger than life, larger than psychology, the situations to be stranger than realism, the resolutions to be more uncomfortable than any clean arc allows. They were exploring forces, not people, forces, ideas, the parts of being human that don't resolve, the parts that are contradictory, uncomfortable, and don't come with good explanations. And here's the thing, that's why they survive. It's not in spite of those qualities, it's because of them. Like, nobody keeps telling the story of Odysseus for 2,000 years because it's relatable. They keep telling it because it captures something about cunning, survival, and the cost of being kind, the kind of person who just finds the way through. That is still true and confusing and does not have a clean answer. The story endures because it contains something larger than a straightforward explanation. And when you remove that largeness, you remove the reason the story is worth retelling. Okay, but here's where it gets complicated, and I want to actually be fair here, because the counter argument is real and it's not stupid. So the counter argument is basically modern audiences need entry points. They need emotional legibility. They can't connect with something that feels alien to their experience. You have to meet people where they are. And okay, that's true in some ways. But watch what happens when you actually look at what the audience responds to. Red One came out and people enjoyed it. Not universally, it's not a perfect movie, but audiences showed up and engaged with it. And that movie is doing something interesting with its mythology. It's not trying to explain Santa Claus. It's not giving Krampus a sympathetic backstory about how his dad didn't hug him enough. It's treating mythological figures as genuine myth. Large, strange, operating with their own logic. And it's wrapped in a modern movie in a nice little bow. And the result is that the mythology works. Not because it's academically faithful, but because the creators seem genuinely excited about the mythology itself. They're leaning into the weird parts instead of apologizing for them. And audiences went along with it because audiences are actually fine with strange. They're fine with large. They're fine with myth logic that doesn't map into normal human psychology. What they're not fine with, and this is part that's important, is when the strange parts get removed and nothing is put in their place. When the myth gets gutted and what you're left with is a pretty normal story wearing myth clothes. And this is where people mess up. They assume the audience is asking for relatability when what the audience is actually asking for is sincerity. Those are two different things. Relatability means the character feels like someone you know. Sincerity means the creator actually believes in what they're making. And an audience can feel that difference instantly. When Red One leans into mythology, there's a sincerity about it. The movie means it, and audiences will follow that sincerity into very strange territory. They'll follow you into giant magical elves and demon Krampuses and North Pole mythology that makes no physical sense, as long as you genuinely mean it. But the moment it feels like the creators are embarrassed by the myth, like they're just apologizing for it while simultaneously using it, that's when people start checking out. Not because the myth is too strange, but because the awkwardness of not committing is strange. And nobody talks about this, but this is exactly why the Harry Potter HBO situation is so fascinating to watch. Because it's not really about Harry Potter at this point. Not entirely. See, what's actually happening is that audiences have become so skeptical of adaptation culture that faithful adaptations is basically a meaningless phrase at this point. Like, the second you say you're making a faithful adaptation, people immediately start looking for signs that it won't be. The conversation then becomes about trust before the show even aired, before anyone has seen a single frame. And that's not irrational. That's a learned response. Because we have been told faithful adaptation and have gotten something that felt disconnected from the source material enough times that we've just stopped trusting the promise. Which is interesting because what they're specifically reacting to isn't really change. It's the feeling that the original work is being treated as a rough draft. Like, the story is good, but it has some problems that need fixing, and the new version is the corrected version. That's what makes the Odyssey discourse feel so uncomfortable to watch. Because the Odyssey is not a rough draft. It's one of the most complete, intentional, culturally specific, thematically loaded pieces of storytelling in human history. It doesn't need correcting. It needs understanding. And those are two completely different projects. So, I want to talk about what understanding actually looks like. Because I think there's a useful example here. Bridgerton. Now, Bridgerton makes massive changes to history. And it's not trying to be accurate. It is openly, explicitly, cheerfully a fantasy version of Regency England. It has a black queen. It has anachronistic music. It prioritizes modern romantic dynamics and modern emotional frameworks over historical accuracy. And it does this loudly, obviously, and without apology. And the thing is, audiences generally accept that. Generally. With some outliers out there, I'm sure. But the beauty of it is that the show is enormously popular. People aren't walking around outraged about the historical liberties because the show itself was never pretending to take history seriously. It's so upfront about what it actually is. The tension that keeps breaking adaptations isn't really about the changes themselves. It's about the mismatch between what a project claims to be and what it actually is. Excuse me. When something says we're being faithful to the source material and then removes the things that made the source material worth being faithful to, that's where the frustration comes in. So when Bridgerton says this is a stylized fantasy romance with historical costumes, people sign up for that shit real quick. But when something says this is the Odyssey, people sign up expecting whatever made the Odyssey worth returning to for 2,000 years. And if you take that out, the thing that you made might be good, but it's not actually the Odyssey. It's just something wearing the Odyssey's name. And this is the issue. And I don't think this is just a Hollywood problem. I really don't. I think this is something that happens in creative work at every level. And this is the part I really want to sit with for a second, because I think it's the more darker side of the uncomfortableness of this situation. How many of us, like people making stuff at this very moment, are doing the same thing to our own work that adaptations do to myths? Like think about that. You come up with a weird idea, a character who behaves in a way that's not fully explainable, a story structure that's strange, an image or concept, a choice that you can't fully justify but feels right. And then you sand it down. You explain it. You soften the edges. You rewrite the strange character into something more legible. You add a scene that explains the symbolism so clearly that it stops being symbolic and just becomes information. And you tell yourself it's in service of the audience. You're making it more accessible, more relatable, easier to connect with. But here's the thing. Sometimes what you're actually doing is removing the very quality that made the idea interesting in the first place. And I'm not saying confusion is a virtue. I'm not saying deliberately obscure work is good work. What I am saying is that there's a difference between an idea that is unclear because it's underdeveloped, or an idea that's weird because it contains something larger than a clean explanation. And I've noticed a lot of creators treat those as the same thing. They encounter their own strangeness and go, yeah, we're going to fix that. And I keep seeing this mistake. Not just in myth adaptations, not just in Hollywood, but in creative work in general. This assumption that accessibility is always the goal. That if something is harder to understand or uncomfortable or just plain weird, the right move is to clarify it, simplify it, make it easier. But some of the most enduring work in the entire history of human storytelling survived precisely because it didn't do that. The Odyssey survived because it contains stuff about identity and survival and the question of whether you can ever really go home. That is still confusing. It doesn't solve cleanly. It doesn't give you a tidy moral at the end. It's uncomfortable and contradictory and never designed to make you feel settled about who you are or what you want. And it's been retold for 2,500 years. There's something in that. Okay, because I want to push on this a little harder, I don't want to just make the keep things mysterious point and leave it there. That's way too easy, and we do not do that here on this channel. And it's also misleading, so I don't want to do that. But because the argument isn't don't change everything or anything. And it's not all adaptations are bad. And it's definitely not audiences can't handle. Ugh, sorry. And it's definitely not audiences can't handle complex myths. See, the actual argument is more specific than that. When you adapt something, when you take a source material and build something new from it, the question you should be asking is, what is the essential quality of this thing? What makes it worth engaging with in the first place? What is the thing that if you removed it, the story stops being itself? And the answer to that question is almost never the exact plot points, the specific character decisions. It's more foundational than that. It's usually something stronger, harder to name. The thing that makes the story feel true even when it's completely fantastical. For the Odyssey, that quality has to do with the nature of the journey itself. Not as a series of obstacles to overcome, but as a test of who Odysseus actually is. Every monster, every goddess, every island is revealing something about his identity, about his temptation, and about the cost of cleverness. The story isn't really about getting home. It's about whether the person who gets home is still the same person who left, and whether that's a good thing. That's a strange idea. That's something that you can't find in modern or psychological storytelling logic in any clean way. And if you adapt the Odyssey without that quality, if you make it a survival story, a war story, a homecoming story, you might end up with something perfectly watchable, but you lost the point and the whole thing that made it the Odyssey. Which I think creators know this on some level. I genuinely hope they know this. Like, when you look at adaptations that work, adaptations that feel like they understand the resource material, even when they've changed things so dramatically, they've always identified that essential quality. They know what that thing is, and they protect it, even while changing everything else. When adaptations fail, it's usually because the question was never seriously asked. Or it was asked and the answer was uncomfortable, and so the more comfortable answer was substituted. So, what does the comfortable answer usually look like? Well, typically is either the characters need to feel like modern people. Actually, no, that's most of it. I mean, seriously. Like they say, they need to have modern psychology. They need to be understandable in a contemporary framework. And I get it. Like, I understand why that feels like the right answer. We live in a culture that has gotten very good at emotional inferiority. We have great tools for showing characters' internal worlds, their trauma, their growth, their complexity, and that's genuinely valuable. It's not nothing. But the mistake is applying these tools to source material that was never trying to do that work. That was trying to do something else, and then wondering why the results feel flat. It's like you have a really good hammer, and you're very proud of this hammer, and you've gotten great at using it, so you walk up to everything and swing the hammer. But mythology was never a nail. And this is where it falls apart, because here's what actually happens when you psychoanalyze mythology too hard. The gods become side characters. because you can't psychoanalyze the Greek gods. They're not traumatized. They're not trying to grow as individuals. They operate by a completely different logic. A logic that's cruel and meaningful in ways that have nothing to do with personal development. And if your story framework requires everything to be psychologically legible, the gods either become obstacles or the comic relief. And the moment the gods become decorative, though, well, you've lost the cosmological scale that made the story a myth. You've basically turned the myth into historical drama with some weird religious stuff going on in the background. Which, again, is okay to make, I guess, but please call it something different. Okay, so let's go back to something I said earlier. The audience question. Because there's an argument that audiences today generally can't engage with myth logic the way ancient audiences could. And that's the cultural context is too different. So they claim. That without growing up in a world where these stories were were real cosmologically, where they shaped how you understood fate and death and divine intervention, you can't just drop a modern audience into that framework and expect it to land. Which, okay, that's true in some ways. You can't adapt the Odysseys straight into modern day and expect it to automatically work. But think about what happens when creators actually respect the myth framework instead of dismantling it. Hadestown, the musical. Take it or leave it as a personal preference, but structurally, it does something fascinating. It keeps the myth logic. Orpheus goes to the underworld is still cosmologically significant. Fate is still a real force. And the story doesn't resolve in a way that feels satisfying. The whole thing is built around the knowledge that the ending doesn't change. The myth is the myth. The fates are real. The story ends the same way it always has. And that's devastating. And audiences sit with that devastation and feel something large. Not despite the myth logic, but because of it. Or something like the God of War. The game, which is an adaptation of Greek mythology that makes huge changes. Kratos is a deeply psychologized, oh my god, I cannot say that word today, I'm sorry, character. He has growth, he has trauma, he has relationships. The game is absolutely engaging with modern frameworks. And it's genuinely interesting, though, in what the myth is doing. It's not treating the gods as plot devices. It's treating them as forces whose behavior reveals something about power, about cycles of violence, and about what it means to be trapped inside a story that keeps repeating. The myth isn't decoration. It's load-bearing. And that game became one of the most celebrated narrative experiences of its generation. So what's the actual difference? Because I've been dancing around it and I want to be precise. So I think the difference is what you believe the myth is for. If you believe the myth is essentially a plot structure, a story skeleton you can strip down and rebuild according to your preferences, well, you're gonna be making one kind of adaptation. You'll take the beats, the names, the broad strokes of the conflict, and rebuild it around modern storytelling logic. But if you believe the mythology is a lens, a way of seeing the human experience, then you're going to write a completely different kind of adaptation. You're going to try to understand what the myth was doing and find a way to do that in a new context. The first approach is fine for a movie with some myth aesthetics. The second is how you actually do the myths justice. And nobody talks about this, but this is exactly the thing I think creatives need to hear. And it's not about myth specifically. The same mistake. The exact same mistake happens in original work all the time. You have an idea, a genuinely interesting, strange idea. And somewhere in the development process, you start asking, does this make sense? Is this accessible? Will people get it? And those are good questions in moderation and in the right proportion. But sometimes the weird thing is the idea. Sometimes the part that doesn't fully make sense is load-bearing. Sometimes the strange, not fully explainable quality of the thing is exactly why it has power. And you sand it down anyway, because the feedback said it was confusing, and because you got in your own head. Because you convinced yourself that accessibility is always the goal. This is where I want to be brutally honest, because I've done this. I've written something strange and immediately started softening it. I've cut the weird character out because I couldn't justify them. I explained the symbolism because I was scared people wouldn't get it. I've taken the rough edge off of scenes because it felt too uncomfortable. And sometimes that is the right call. Sometimes something is underdeveloped or unclear in a way that just creates friction without meaning. But sometimes it's not. Sometimes the thing that seems confusing or strange or hard to explain is, well, it's because it's true in a way that resists easy explanations. And when you sand it down, you don't make it better. You make it smaller. You make it into the Odyssey adaptation, where Odysseus is just a sad guy who misses home. Okay, I want to come back to the Odyssey thing one more time because I think the discourse around this adaptation is revealing something about where we are as a storytelling culture right now. And this is where it gets weird because I don't think the frustration people are experiencing and expressing is really about the specific changes. Like, yes, there are changes that are being discussed, and some of them are pretty significant. But the intensity of the reaction is disproportionate to the specific changes, if that's all it were. What's actually happening is that people have learned to pattern match. They've seen enough adaptations where the messaging was we're honoring the source material, and the result felt like the source material was more apologized for than anything else. And now when they hear a similar language around a new project, the gut reaction is preemptive. They're not reacting to what the show is, they're reacting to the pattern. Which is why the Harry Potter situation is such an interesting counterpoint. Because the argument for the HBO show is we're going to be more faithful this time, and the audience's reaction was not enthusiastic. It was more like, okay, but you've said that before, and now we're watching everything for signs of truth. See, that's the trust problem. Not a change problem, a trust problem. And that trust problem doesn't come from like one or two bad adaptations. It comes from a sustained period of adaptations that seemed more interested in updating the source material than understanding it, that treated beloved stories as rough drafts in need of modernization. And, well, we need to admit something, because this isn't entirely the fault of the people making the adaptations. There's a creative culture, especially in the current landscape. Give me a second, guys. Okay, where were we? Oh, yes. The creative culture, especially in the current landscape, genuinely believes that adding psychological complexity is always an improvement. That making things morally ambiguous is always more nuanced. That giving characters more interiority is always more sophisticated. And yes, that can work in the right context, but that framework applied to mythology actively destroys what mythology is trying to do. Because mythology is not about individuals navigating complex personal situations. It's a story or stories about forces operating at a scale beyond individuals. And when you reduce it to individuals, well, you reduce the scale. And without the scale, it's not a myth anymore. It's just drama. And this is what annoys me, because the really frustrating version of this mistake is when it's done well. Like when this psychological version is actually good. When the characters are compelling and the drama is real and the writing is strong. But it's still missing the thing that made the source material myth. Because then you're not watching a failed adaptation, you're watching a success story that stripped the mythology out and replaced it with drama, but kept the mythology's name. And that's harder to explain why it's wrong. It's easier to call people nostalgic or resistance to change when the result is actually enjoyable. But the question isn't whether the new thing is good. The question is whether it understood the old thing before it changed it. Okay. I want to be careful here because I've been kind of dancing close to a conclusion I don't actually believe. So I'm not saying that all myth adaptations fail. I'm not saying the instinct to update mythology is always wrong. I'm just saying there's a specific pattern of failure I keep seeing. And I think it comes from a specific misunderstanding of what mythology is for. And the misunderstanding is this: mythology isn't hard to adapt because it's old. It's hard to adapt because it was built around ideas that actively resist the conventions of modern storytelling. Myths were designed to hold contradictions, to be simultaneously true and impossible, to create meaning through strangeness rather than despite it, to explore things that can't be resolved. And modern storytelling, at least the dominant mainstream version of it, is built around resolution, about character arcs that complete, around emotional legibility, around making audiences feel oriented. And those two things are in genuine conflict constantly. Not unsolvable conflict, but real conflict. The adaptations that work, though, the ones that actually do the myths justice, are the ones where the creators recognized the conflict and chose to honor the myth's logic instead of defaulting to modern storytelling. So, what does it actually look like to honor myth logic? Well, that's one of the main reasons I love Red 1. And I will die on that hill. Because it's so useful in this context. Like, the movie is not sophisticated. It's not trying to be. But it does something right. It commits full-fledged. Like, it decides the myth beings operate by their own myth logic, and it doesn't bother justifying that logic in realistic terms. Santa Claus is a myth figure. Krampus is a myth figure. They're large and strange and operate by rules that don't need explanations. And the movie wraps the human story around that. A character who exists in a world that contains this myth, who have to navigate it. But it doesn't try to reduce the myth to the human scale. The humans adapt to the myth. Again, the myth doesn't shrink. And that feels right. That feels like understanding what myth and mythology is for. Compare that to every adaptation that decides the gods need to be explained, or the myth figures need to be rationalized, or the magical system needs to be given a scientific basis, or the cosmological framework needs to be comprehensible in modern terms. Every time that happens, the myth gets smaller. Not because explanation is bad. Explanation is useful, but the power from the mythology comes partly from its refusal to fully explain, from the things it leaves unresolved, from the forces that operate beyond the character's control or understanding. When you explain the forces, when you trace Odysseus' cunning back to a childhood wound, A combined with survival instinct B, resulting in personality pattern C, you've made Odysseus small. You've basically turned a mythological force into a case study. And that's the mistake I keep seeing. And this is where I really want to land on this. The instinct to make things inexplicable or explicable isn't bad. It comes from genuine craft interest. But there's a difference between helping your audience understand and helping your audience explain. The best myths don't want you to explain them. They want you to feel, they want you to carry it, they want you to turn it over and return to it because there's something in there that hasn't resolved yet. And that's why we've been retelling the story of Odysseus for 2,000 years. Not because it makes perfect sense, but because it contains something about identity and belonging and the question of whether you can survive your own cleverness that is still real and still unresolved and still larger than any clean explanation can hold. So where does this leave the people actually making things? Because I don't want this to just be cultural commentary. I want it to be actually useful. So if you're working on an adaptation of anything, the question you should be sitting with isn't how do I make this relatable to modern audiences? The question should be what is the story carrying that I haven't found the words for yet? Because every story that has survived long enough to be worth adapting is carrying something, some quality, some truth that keeps changing relevancy or keeps being more relevant as even as the context changes. And your job as the adapter is to find that thing and figure out how to carry it into a new form. Not fix it, not update it, but carry it. And for the people making original work, because everything I've said about adaptations is also true about originality, just 1 degree removed. When you have a strange idea and you start softening it, stop. Please. Ask first, is this strange because it's underdeveloped? Or is it strange because it's true in a way I haven't figured out how to say it yet? Because those require different responses. Underdevelopment needs work. It needs you to dig deeper until it becomes something. But the true, but not in a way you can say it, needs protection. It needs you to build a story around it that lets it remain weird in a way while giving the audience a way in. That way doesn't have to be full of understanding. It just has to be a reason to stay. Audiences will follow you into very uncomfortable, strange, unresolved territory as long as they trust that you are going somewhere, even if you can't fully tell them where. The myths didn't explain where they were going. They didn't offer resolution or comfort or moral takeaways. They offered something stranger. They offered the experience of being in the presence of a truth larger than you, something that had always been there and will keep being there long after the story ends. That's why they've survived. Not because they made sense, but because they contained something that won't let go. And I think creators know this on some level. Like they know that weirdness is not the problem and that it's load bearing. But then the feedback comes back or the notes say X doesn't feel relatable and or the test audience is confused and that instinct kicks in. Well, maybe the result is fine. Maybe they're good. But somewhere in the process, the thing that's going to be unforgettable becomes the thing that may as well be executed on site with one bullet. And very well executed is not why the Odyssey is still here. I don't know. That's just where I'm at with that. So I'm going to open it up to you guys. I'm curious what you guys think about this. What is your take on this adaptation material? And do you feel like it actually, any of them out there actually understand the source material? Or do you disagree with me about Red 1 that it didn't understand the source material? And anyway, I do want to hear it and talk about it in the comments below. So if this made you think, like the video. Subscribe if you want more stuff like this. This is WriteSparky, and I will see you in the next video.